Under the blackened sky of New Chicago, Lieutenant Mason Reed stood among the broken towers and twisted metal. The city was silent, except for the distant crackle of flames, and the cold wind carrying the smell of smoke. His boots crunched over shattered glass. With every step, his comm unit buzzed weakly. Then a voice came through, deep, calm, and full of arrogant confidence. It was the alien commander of the Wraithy fleet, saying, "Humans, you are fragile. You are animals that cannot last much longer. Surrender, and you may live." Mason tightened his jaw and looked up at the clouds that were not clouds at all, but the enormous shadows of alien warships covering the horizon. The streets around him were littered with the remains of machines and the bodies of people who had fought and failed, yet his eyes held no surrender. He closed the comm unit and whispered, "We are not done yet." The wind shifted and a sheet of metal clanged somewhere in the distance, and Mason's mind pulled him back to the day. It all began 3 months earlier. The Wraithy had appeared without warning, massive ships sliding into orbit like predators circling prey. They sent one message to Earth in every language: you have 72 hours to kneel or be destroyed. Panic swept across the world. The United Nations scrambled leaders. Argued, some begged for mercy. Others spoke of resistance, but the truth was grim. The Wraitha were not just stronger. They were a species that had crushed dozens of civilizations before. Humanity even learned to split the atom. Every news broadcast showed alien fleets orbiting other worlds, dead silent as their victims burned on the second day. Governments began to fall. Smaller nations gave in thinking. Surrender meant survival. Mason had been stationed at Fort Grant outside Chicago. When the order came to evacuate civilians, he remembered the sight of families boarding military transports, tears streaming down their faces as the sky grew darker with the shadows of alien craft. But there were whispers then of something else, something secret in the depths of the Pentagon and the hidden vaults of old space stations, an operation no one would confirm, and no one dared to name until Mason overheard his commander speak it. Aloud, Operation Iron Veil. It was not a defensive plan. It was a strike, a desperate, impossible strike. In those days, the Wraitha made a mistake. They believed Earth was already broken. Their broadcasts flooded every channel showing footage of cities in ruins, alien patrols walking through burning streets, and the voices of their leaders saying, "Your fight is over yet." In hidden rooms underground, resistance cells watched those same broadcasts and smiled because they were studying them. Every shadow, every patrol route, every ship in the background was a clue. Mason was assigned to a recon unit in the remains of Detroit. There they hacked into a downed alien drone. Its systems were unlike anything human engineers had seen. Yet there was a flaw. A faint pulse in its power readings that matched reports from other teams. A weakness in the Wraitha gravity drives. It was almost nothing but to a desperate species. It was hope, and hope was dangerous. Mason carried that hope through the wastelands of America, avoiding alien patrols and drones that scanned the ground with blinding light. Once in Kansas, he hid in a flooded subway tunnel for 2 days, as alien boots echoed above, and the air smelled of burning fuel and wet rust when he finally emerged. The world felt emptier, but the message he carried burned hotter than ever. The idea that humans could unite, even for a moment, to strike back. He saw it in the eyes of survivors along the way. A farmer in Nebraska who refused to abandon his land welding armor to an old tractor. A group of teenagers in Colorado who had built an EMP from scrap parts. An old woman in Arizona who had once flown during the Mars colonization and still had the steady hands of a pilot. They all asked him the same thing: is it true? Are we going to fight back? And every time Mason answered yes, because he had to believe it himself. Now, standing in the ruins of New Chicago, he thought of them. He thought of the plan of the maps, hidden in his pack of the codes. Etched in his mind, he knew the enemy believed this was the end. They thought humans would kneel. They thought the fires would burn out the will to resist, but Mason's fingers curled into a fist as he looked at the alien shadows blotting out the sun, and he whispered again, "We are not done yet. Only this time." He did not whisper it to himself. He spoke it into the comm unit on an open channel, so every survivor, every hidden fighter, and maybe even the aliens themselves could hear the voice of one soldier standing alone in the ruins, declaring that humanity would not break. Above the shattered remains of Earth's cities, the Vratha fleet drifted in perfect formation like a wall of black steel, each ship shaped like a blade slicing. Through the sky, they had no fear, no hesitation. They had done this before on dozens of worlds. Their commanders sat in towering control rooms, watching the planet through enormous view screens. They studied humanity as if watching a trapped animal. The reports were clear. Humans were emotional, unstable, divided by borders and politics. They were easy to crush in the eyes of the Vratha. There was no need for a massive ground invasion, just a show of power and patience the humans would destroy. Themselves under the weight of fear in the capital ship's council chamber, the alien warlord Varkor addressed his officers, his voice cold as the void, saying, "The humans are almost finished. We have broken their largest cities, and their leaders are begging for scrap soon. They will kneel without us firing another shot." The officers nodded confident in their victory. What they did not know was that every broadcast they sent, every moment of their arrogance, was being recorded by the very people they thought were finished. The human resistance was not dead. It was learning deep underground in abandoned subway systems, hidden bunkers, and remote mountain shelters. Fighters studied the alien transmissions, they mapped troop movements. And supply routes, they noted the patterns of the Vrathi patrols and the strange low hum that always came from their engines. That hum was the key to the one hope humanity had left. Lieutenant Mason Reed had joined one of these resistance cells. In the old industrial zones of Chicago, the cell was small, just 12 people armed with stolen weapons and scavenged tech. But they had something more valuable than firepower. They had a piece of alien machinery, a fallen drone half buried in rubble, and burned almost beyond recognition. It had crashed during one of the early raids. Its wings shattered its systems, flickering like a dying animal. The team's engineer, a wiry man named Cole, worked on it day and night, pulling apart panels, rerouting wires until finally the drone came to life for a few seconds before dying again. But in that moment, Cole had seen something strange, a power reading that should not have been there. Mason listened as Cole explained it to the group, the Wraith gravity. Drive was shielded against every known kind of attack except one. A certain kind of overload that could only be triggered from inside the ship. It was a weakness so small it sounded like a rumor, but Mason knew it was enough to try the news of the discovery spread quietly from cell to cell, carried by trusted messengers and encrypted signals. It reached the last remnants of the UN defense fleet, hiding in the shadows of the asteroid belt. Those commanders did not laugh. They saw the same thing. Mason did an opening for a strike, but unity was still a fragile dream. Some leaders argued it was suicide, that attacking the Vratha now would bring total destruction. Others said waiting would only give the enemy time to finish the job. In the ruins of an old train station, Mason met with leaders of nearby cells. They came from every background: soldiers, scientists, farmers, even a few former criminals who had decided they hated aliens more than the law. The meeting was tense. Each person carried scars from the war, some fresh, some old. But when Mason laid out the plan, their eyes began to change. Operation Iron Veil was not about defending what was left. It was about hitting the enemy so hard they would remember humanity as more than prey. The Vratha, meanwhile, continued their campaign of psychological warfare. They patrolled the skies with massive drones broadcasting footage of human defeat. They showed burning homes, crying children, shattered monuments, thinking each image was a nail in the coffin. But those same images became tools for the resistance. Every broadcast gave them another piece of the puzzle, a glimpse of a supply depot, a pattern in the ship movements, even the reflection of a star in the hull that hinted. At a hidden docking bay, Mason began training for infiltration missions, running drills in the shadows of collapsed buildings, practicing silence timing his steps to the rhythm of the alien patrols. He learned how to avoid their scanners by hiding behind old steel beams or even standing still in pools of dark water when the drones passed above each move was dangerous. One mistake, and the mission would die before it began. But Mason believed in the plan because he had seen something the aliens had not. The human will to fight was not gone. It was growing. It was becoming something sharper than fear. Something the Wraithie had never faced before one night. As Mason lay hidden in the remains of an old apartment building, he heard the alien broadcasts again, the same deep voice promising mercy. If humans surrendered, the same cold tone speaking of human weakness. Mason almost laughed. They had no idea that every word they spoke was making the resistance stronger. He closed his eyes and imagined the moment when the Wraithie would finally see humans not as fragile animals, but as the species that dared to strike back. Mason moved through the broken skeleton of what had once been a thriving city, heading west toward the last place where the resistance fleet was said to gather. His pack was heavy with stolen data drives and scraps of alien tech wrapped in cloth. To hide their faint glow, every step was a risk, because the Wraithie patrols were everywhere. Their drones swept the skies with beams of white light, and their boots clanged on the metal streets they had built over human roads. He traveled mostly, at night slipping through alleys or crawling through old sewer tunnels where the air was damp and thick with the smell of rust and mold. Yet along the way, he saw something the aliens would never understand in the farmlands of Nebraska he found. A man who refused to leave his fields. The man's tractor was covered in welded steel plates, and its engine had been modified to run on biofuel made from corn stalks. He showed Mason how he had been hiding human refugees inside the tractors. Grain tank moving them to safe houses under the noses of alien patrols further along in Colorado. Mason met a group of teenagers hiding in the ruins of a school. They had scavenged parts from old science labs and built a crude EMP bomb that could knock out an alien drone for 5 minutes, just enough for a resistance team to grab it and strip it for parts. Their leader, a girl barely 17 with grease on her hands, told Mason, "We don't have ships, but we can still fight, and in the deserts." Of Arizona, he met an old woman with hair the color of ash and eyes that still burned like stars. She had flown cargo runs during the Mars colonization era, and still had the steady hands of a pilot. She offered to join the fight if someone could get her a ship. Each meeting was like a spark, and Mason carried those sparks with him until they began to feel like a fire. The message of Operation Iron Veil was spreading not as an order, but as a promise: fight as one or die as none. And slowly, people who had been strangers became part of something larger in the underground shelters where resistance cells hid. Mason would see former soldiers sharing food with scientists who had never held a gun. He would see people from countries that once fought bitter wars now sitting together over maps planning strikes on alien targets. There were arguments, yes. Old grudges flared, but each time someone would remind them of the simple truth: the enemy saw them all as the same. They were human, and that was enough to unite them. Meanwhile, the Wraithie watched from orbit, confident that what they saw on the ground was chaos. They mistook the whispers of unity for the final gasps of a dying species their commanders laughed at. Intercepted human transmissions, thinking them meaningless chatter, but hidden in those messages were coordinates and codes for gathering points, supply drops, and planned raids. Mason finally reached the meeting point in the Rocky Mountains, a vast network of caves shielded from scanners by the natural minerals in the rock. There, the remnants of Earth's defense fleet waited, battered ships tucked deep underground, their hulls patched with whatever the engineers could find. The air inside the caves was thick with oil smoke and the sound of welding torches. The commanders greeted Mason like a soldier returning from the front lines. They took the data he had risked his life to carry and began planning the next phase. The unity he had feared might be an illusion was real. He saw it in the way crews from 3 different continents worked side by side to fit alien tech into human ships, in the way pilots swapped stories and tactics regardless of flag, in the way no one asked where you came from, only what you could do the night before the plan was to be set in motion. Mason stood outside the cave entrance looking at the stars. The alien ships were out there, their lights like cold fire in the black sky. They thought they owned the night. They thought fear had hollowed out the human spirit. Mason knew better. He had seen the farmers, the teenagers, the old pilot, and the soldiers. He knew that tomorrow, when the signal came, they would all move as one. He whispered to himself the words that had carried him this far: we fight as one or we die as none. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the shift the moment when the war stopped being about survival and became about showing the galaxy how humans fight back. The order came just before dawn, a low crackle through the encrypted comms, followed by a single phrase: Iron Veil is in motion. Mason was already in his gear when the words reached him. The caves came alive with movement, crews rushing to load weapons and fuel into ships. Engineers making last-minute adjustments to stolen alien tech. Every face carried the same look, not fear, not exactly, but the sharp awareness that what they were about to do would either break the enemy or end them all. The plan was simple in design, impossible in execution. A fleet of modified human ships would launch to draw the Wraith's attention, while a handful of infiltration teams approached disguised as debris cloaked in scrap metal and the heat signatures of shattered satellites. Mason's team was one of those ghosts. Their target was the Wraithy flagship, a monstrous vessel that hung in orbit above Earth, its hull black and smooth, its edges glowing faintly with the hum of its gravity core. The same core Cole had discovered could be overloaded from within the ship. Mason strapped into the narrow cabin of the shuttle that would carry them close. The walls were lined with jagged plating collected from destroyed drones. Their engineer swore it would fool the scanners. But Mason knew once they got close, there would be no second chance. The launch was silent, no engines flaring until they were far beyond the mountain range. The shuttle rose into the dark sky, blending with the field of wreckage the aliens themselves had created. Through months of bombardment in the distance, Mason saw the decoy fleet streak upward, bright trails against the black. The Wraith ships moved immediately, shifting their formation to block the human attack. It was working. The distraction bought them the space they needed to drift closer to the flagship. The closer they got, the more the ship seemed to fill the stars, its surface dotted with pulsing lights that moved like veins through a living thing. The shuttle shuddered as it passed through the edge of the enemy's scanner net. The crew held their breath. Each second stretched until Mason could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. A red light flashed on the control panel. A proximity scan had locked onto them. Mason's fingers closed around the grip of his rifle, but before he could move, the light turned green. The old Mars-era stealth trick had worked. The Wraithy would see them only as part of the endless wreckage surrounding their fleet. They drifted under the shadow of the flagship until its hull loomed above like a cliff of black metal. The docking clamps engaged with a faint clang, and the shuttle's hatch slid open, releasing the smell of cold, recycled air. The team moved quickly, silent as shadows stepping onto the alien surface, their boots clinking softly on the strange alloy. The entry point Cole had mapped was small, almost invisible. A service hatch tucked beneath one of the ship's heat vents. Mason knelt beside it, pulling a small cutting torch. From his pack, the blue flame licked at the edges until the panel gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel glowing with dim green light. They slipped inside. The air was warmer here, and filled with a faint vibration, the sound of the gravity core's pulse. They moved deeper into the ship, navigating sharp corridors, lined with alien script and smooth black walls that seemed to swallow sound. Every corner was a danger. Once an alien patrol rounded the bend ahead, 3 tall figures with segmented armor and glowing visors. The team froze, pressing against the wall. Mason could feel the heat from their armor as they passed within inches. His breath stayed trapped in his lungs until they were gone. The path to the core chamber was longer than they had expected, winding through what looked like storage bays and energy conduits. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast room dominated by the gravity core itself, a sphere of blinding white energy suspended in a cradle of black steel. The pulse was louder here, vibrating through their bones. Cole moved forward, pulling the explosives from his pack. Each charge was designed to overload the stabilizers around the core. They had only minutes. Once the first one was armed, Mason took position by the entrance rifle, ready in case the patrol returned. His mind flickered to the people he had met on his journey: the farmer, the teenagers, the old pilot, each one counting on him to see this through. The last charge clicked into place. Cole's voice was steady as he said, "It's set. Let's move." They slipped back into the tunnels, retracing their steps, the vibration under their feet growing stronger as the timer counted down. But just as they reached the hatch, the sound of boots came again. Faster this time, the alien patrol had returned. Mason didn't think he moved, stepping into the open, firing in short, controlled bursts. The aliens reeled back, their armor sparking, but the hallway behind them filled with more shadows. Cole shouted, "Go, go!" Mason backed toward the hatch, firing until his rifle clicked empty. The last thing he saw before diving into the shuttle was the flash of the first charge igniting inside the core. Then the world turned white. The blast hit like the fist of a dying starlight, erupted from the Vrathi flagship's core in a blinding sphere that swallowed the shuttle's viewports for a heartbeat. There was no sound, only the sight of space itself bending and tearing. Then the shock wave struck the shuttle, flinging it sideways, spinning them through the field of wreckage. Alarms screamed in Mason's ears as he fought to stabilize the controls. The flagship's hull was collapsing inward, its own gravity core imploding, with such force that the nearest ships in its formation were dragged into the spiraling chaos, their black armor cracking under the invisible pull. Pieces of alien metal spun past the shuttle, some the size of buildings. One clipped the edge of their plating, sending another jolt through the cabin. Cole was shouting something over the comms, but Mason could barely hear him through the static outside. The chaos spread like fire. The implosion ignited secondary explosions along the Vrathi fleet, as energy conduits. Overloaded ships were tearing apart in brilliant bursts of light and debris. The human decoy fleet saw their moment and surged forward, missiles cutting through the weakened formation. The sky over Earth lit up with streaks of fire as alien ships fell from orbit like burning meteors, crashing into the oceans and plains below. Mason wrestled with the shuttle controls, steering them out of the blast radius, but their engines coughed and sputtered. The damage from the debris was worse than he thought. Warning lights flared red across the console, fuel lines, ruptured power bleeding away. Cole's voice came clearer. "Now, we can't make it to the fleet. We'll have to get closer to the fight and dock with one of ours." Mason scanned the comm channels through the static. A familiar voice cut through: Commander Harlow from the hidden fleet's flagship. His tone was fierce and urgent. "Iron Veil, team status." Mason replied, "Core destroyed. Repeat. Core destroyed. Enemy fleet. In chaos, request emergency pickup." Harlow didn't hesitate, sending coordinates for a rendezvous point, but the Vrathi were already trying to recover their control. Smaller strike ships darted through the wreckage, targeting human vessels. Mason gritted his teeth, pushing the shuttle harder, even as the hull groaned under the strain. In the distance, he saw one of the human capital ships, a battered vessel named the Resolute, tearing through the alien line, its guns blazing like twin suns. He turned toward it, but a shadow passed over them, a Wraithy interceptor, its sleek frame cutting across the stars, its weapons lit with cold blue fire. Mason swerved hard as energy blasts ripped past their hull. Cole manned the side turret returning. Fire the impacts shook the shuttle. But the alien pilot was skilled weaving through the wreckage with predator precision. Mason knew they couldn't win a drawn-out dogfight, not with their systems failing, so he made a choice. He angled the shuttle toward the debris field of the flagship, flying dangerously close to the drifting chunks of metal the interceptor followed. But in its pursuit, one of the larger hull fragments spun into its path, smashing into its side. The alien craft tumbled out of control before vanishing in a burst of flame. Mason didn't slow. He pushed them onward toward the Resolute, just as another explosion flared behind them. The rest of the Wraithy fleet was pulling back, retreating from Earth's orbit, their lines. Broken, their command vessel gone. Their arrogance shattered, the human fleet chased them as far as they could, striking hard before the enemy disappeared into the void. The shuttle limped toward the Resolute's docking bay, the interior lights flickering. Mason's hands ached from gripping the controls when they finally crossed the threshold, magnetic clamps locking them in place. The airlock cycled, and the smell of oil and metal filled his lungs as the hatch opened. Harlow was there, waiting his, eyes wide with disbelief and something like pride. "You did it." He said, his voice low, but charged with energy. Mason nodded, too exhausted to speak. Cole handed over the data drives from the mission, confirming the destruction of the core and the damage. To the enemy. Fleet cheers erupted through the bay, the sound echoing against the steel walls, but Mason barely heard them. His gaze was drawn to the view beyond the open hangar doors. Earth hung there, battered and bruised, but alive fires still burned. In some places, but the sky was clearer than it had been in months. The shadow of alien ships gone from its face. Harlow placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, saying, "This isn't the end. Not by a long shot, but today we showed them something they won't forget." Mason finally spoke, his voice steady. "Now they thought we'd break instead. We showed them how humans fight back." The hangar was still roaring with voices when Mason stepped away from the crowd, needing a moment to breathe. His body ached from the mission, but his mind was sharper than ever. Through the wide viewing panels, he saw Earth turning slowly against the black canvas of space. Whole cities lay in ruins. Rivers ran black with ash and smoke curled upward from distant continents. Yet, for the first time since the invasion began, the planet's skies were free from the heavy shadow of the Wraitha fleet. The enemy had retreated, leaving only scattered wreckage drifting in orbit. The cost had been unbearable, but the impossible had happened. The Wraithy had been forced to run the comms, crackled constantly, as scattered human resistance cells across the globe reported in their voices, carrying disbelief and joy. In equal measure, small towns in the Midwest emerging from hiding. Coastal cities counting their survivors, mountain enclaves where families had lived underground for months now, daring to see daylight again. The sound of cheering and crying mixed together, spilling from every channel. Mason listened without speaking, letting it sink in. The aliens had called them fragile. They had called them animals. They had believed fear would crush humanity from the inside, but fear had not won. Something else had taken its place. The will to stand, even when standing meant death. Harlow approached again, his face tired, but lit with the quiet satisfaction of a commander who had seen a turning point with his own eyes. He handed Mason a datapad showing intercepted Wraithy transmissions, their language sharp and full of static, but even without translation, the tone was clear. The enemy was shaken, their commanders arguing over what had gone wrong. Some demanded immediate reinforcements. Others wanted to abandon Earth entirely. It was the first sign of division Mason had ever seen in them, and it sent a surge of grim hope through him. But Harlow's voice stayed cautious. "They'll come back, Mason, and when they do, they'll be ready for us next time." Mason knew he was right. This victory was only a crack in the armor, not the final blow. The war was far from over. but the message they had sent would echo across the stars. The Vrethi prided themselves on fear as a weapon. Now that weapon had failed, the rest of the day passed in a blur, repair crews swarming over the damaged ships, medical teams rushing to treat the wounded pilots, rearming for whatever came next. Mason found himself in the briefing room hours later, maps and star charts covering the walls, engineers explaining how much of the stolen alien tech could be reproduced quickly. Most of it could not, but some could. And that was enough. Word came in from deep space relays that human colonies on Mars and Europa had picked up the battle's transmissions for them. It was proof Earth still lived. For the first time in months, they sent their own message back, a simple one: we fight with you. The weight of those words settled on Mason heavier than any weapon. The fight was no longer just Earth's to bear. Harlow stood at the front of the room, outlining the next phase. Not a defensive operation, but a strike into enemy-held space. It was ambitious, reckless, maybe even impossible, but everyone in the room listened with the same fire in their eyes, the kind Mason had seen in the farmer's stubborn stare, the teenager's defiance, the old pilot's steady hands. When the meeting ended, Mason walked alone through the quiet corridors of the Resolute. His boots echoing on the steel deck plates, he stopped at a small observation bay where the view was nothing but stars and drifting debris. He thought about what the Vrethi must be saying in their war councils tonight, how they would try to explain how the prey had turned and bitten back. He imagined their confusion, their anger, their disbelief. Then he thought of Earth, its battered cities, and its unbroken spirit. He thought of the people who would rebuild, not because the war was over, but because that was what humans did. Even in the shadow of destruction, they built. They adapted. They endured. Mason placed a hand on the glass, feeling the cold of space beyond it, and spoke softly into the silence, not for anyone to hear, but for himself, and maybe for the stars. Now we take the fight to them. The words hung there like a promise, as the ship's engines rumbled beneath his feet. Somewhere out there, the Vrethi were regrouping, and somewhere closer, the human fleet was preparing to leave Earth's orbit for the first time since the invasion began. The war was entering a new chapter, and Mason Reed knew the galaxy was about to learn exactly why humans never broke.